Welcome to Testing Experts with Opinions, an inspired testing podcast aimed at creating conversations about trends, tools, and technology in the software testing space.
Hello and welcome to this second discussion on the role of a QA within a Scrum team. We had a part one, which we recorded maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. Today is the second part of this. I'm not going to ask the guys how they are because I know how they are because I've spoken to all of them today. So we'll jump straight into it. Stefan, do you mind just giving us a quick recap on the first part and what we discussed and in that first session, and then we can continue from where we left off last time.
Sure, thanks, Leon. Yeah, I mean, just looking at it holistically, there are separate phases that we focus on as we go through the motions of tackling a project that's using Scrum as a methodology. So I think the very first one we touched on was the importance of creating a test plan. Different teams might have different, how shall I say, the amount of detail that they put in a test plan might differ from team to team, but without that initial map, at least, I think it's going to be difficult to manage a project. And I think one of the main things is that it should never be just an artifact that you're just trying to get out of the way. It should be a living document and something that you should always refer back to and change it and adapt it as the project changes. The second one was referring to the product backlog grooming. And I think the focus there, as it states in the picture, is just that the tester should always be part of the process of ripening the user stories, making sure that they have input into making sure that the acceptance criteria is clear and well defined, and that especially in terms of the sizing, that it's important, and that the definition of ready and definition of done has all the necessary QA components within it. And then when we get closer to a sprint itself, doing the planning, making sure that there's actually sufficient capacity, that the test analysts aren't over allocated. I think we also mentioned that in terms of devs, sometimes it's a small change in terms of small effort in terms of the development, but the impact on testing can be massive. So to always make sure that there's sufficient time for the required testing tasks. And just to make sure that the definition of ready is met. And lastly on that block is that sometimes, it's not only the test analyst that needs to do testing. There are other external parties like security testing or performance testing that needs to be coordinated. And the test analyst or the test in the group needs to play that role of always making sure that that's in line and arranged. So I think today we'll focus on the middle one, the in-sprint activities. So the first one speaks to preparing and executing the test cases. And I in brackets says including pair testing between testers and devs. So in terms of pair testing, that's obviously a practice that brings the devs and the testers closer together, and to try and shift testing far more to the left. So that takes different flavors. Sometimes it can be as the dev develops, he pulls the tester in, or it can be sometimes more and more as part of the formal code reviews. So I'm not sure if any of you have any comments on that or anything that you'd like to comment or add.
Have you done pair testing with a BA? So you have a dev with a BA when you're looking at, it's more like a UAT side of the house, but have you done pair testing with non-devs before?
Not myself.
That's a thing I see happening more often than testers with devs, really. Historically, I've seen that testers are very closely aligned with the BAs and doing that pair testing rather than with the devs. I think this is advocating that we get closer to the devs as well when it comes to testing. You, Stephen, have you seen some of that happening?
Yeah, I think I agree. My experience is the same. It's easier. It tends to be easier to get hold of BAs and get time with them than it tend to be with devs. So my experience of pair testing is predominantly from a business perspective rather than the solution side. It can be a bit of a challenge, I think, in sprints.
Although that is where we want to be. I think if you look at the testing pyramids and the shift lefts and the quality gates and all those things, it's really what we are advocating for is trying to get closer to the devs and pair testing. I think theoretically it makes sense. It's practically how do we actually get a system or a process or a framework which will allow us to do that. But as a goal and an ideal, I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely agree. And just for people that aren't like familiar with pair testing, like what's the advantages there is, one of the simple things is bouncing ideas off of two people from two completely different perspectives. So the tester will get more understanding of how the system is meant to be implemented, and dev's going to get a perspective of how the user is potentially going to interact with that system. And then from the BA's perspective, we can help them consider things like negative paths or more edge cases that they're considering from the business user cases. So there's real advantages to all parties to engage in sort of practices. It helps them just as much as it does the testers.
And it's really taking that three amigos concept, I suppose, a little bit further into a more practical setting as well, where you are now doing it rather than just talking about things. And it's often in the doing that the questions arise, and in the doing that people start following their own mind. And it's important then to bring that back to the collective to understand.
I think the communication part of it is also important, breaking down that barrier, that intimidation. Sometimes testers historically don't always feel comfortable working in that space, but sitting next to a dev, you don't necessarily need to be able to write code to be able to get an idea of what the code is trying to do. Just glance over it, sort of get the feel of it, and getting closer to that world. I think it's a good way to get them comfortable with IDEs and what code looks like to move them into more of a technical mindset. So makes it a bit more practical. Yeah, so I mean, the next one, log defects, test fixes, those are pretty standard things. Not sure if you have any comments on that in terms of the Agile way of working, but
I think the only thing I would say on that is you sometimes see defects that are low prioritized. They'll go back into the backlog and won't necessarily get fixed in that sprint cycle. So that can create a problem with technical debt where you're accumulating lots of minor defects and minor problems as the sprints progress, and you're building up this big backlog of technical debt in the background, which needs to be fixed. Often leads to, I've seen like refactoring sprints where they will just take all the existing defects that weren't closed in the last, say, 4 to 5 sprints and just work on those and nothing else. I think it can be quite difficult to maintain the balance between producing new features and fixing existing lower priority problems in the background that the business isn't that concerned about.
So how do you, my question then, this is something we face often, how do you practically deal with defects within a sprint? Now, there's a lot of theory and there's a right answer, but what you've seen in organizations, Stefan and Steve, how do you really deal with it, and how do you plan for those unforeseen things that will come up in that sprint, especially around defects and retesting them and fixing them? What have you seen working and not working?
Well, I think if you know what your team's velocity is, always build in some fat for that reworking of work. Don't just allocate stories at the beginning of the sprint to your full team's capacity or velocity. I think you need to build in that 30% or whatever your team feels comfortable with, knowing that there will be rework and retesting required. So it's anticipating it and catering, building in some fat or some space for that.
Which theoretically is the correct answer. But what we've seen here is now VPs of engineering looks at it and say 30% of your sprint, you're planning for things that you did incorrectly to start off with. Surely we need a better system than that, right? So yeah, sure, but now you're cutting your capacity by 30% because you think we're not going to do a good job. And it's always difficult to motivate for that. They want developers to be as utilized as possible within a sprint, and then not to have 30% buffer for things that may or may not happen. And the other trick is they might happen later in the sprint, where if you find something big later in the sprint, what do you do then? Is that stopping the sprint, reworking, trying to fit in regression again? So from a practical experience, what have you seen really working and they're not working really?
Like I guess like some good practices is making sure you don't have non-allocated defects. So I've seen it where you'd have a defect on the board that wasn't associated with a user story, just floating around somewhere in the ether. Or that would be in the backlog, wasn't allocated. Making sure that your defects, when raised, are associated with something else in the sprint. Otherwise, they're going to get ignored and left. I've seen that tends to be again something to work around. And I think there's depending on how long the squad's been together, is making sure the product owner or equivalent has an understanding that us finding defects isn't a problem, right? And that eventually it's going to stabilize as the developers get more mature in their coding standards, as the testers get a better relationship with everybody, as the quality of the user stories start to improve. You would like to see eventually that the defects will start to reduce in terms of quantity and stabilize, and that's showing that the quality is pretty consistent. I think what is good to do is to track that. So track that defect trend is coming down, and then look for some analysis around when you get spikes. Okay, so we've done this particular bit of backend development, really problematic, and it's led to a huge spike in the amount of defects we've got in this sprint. So I think there's using some pretty simplistic analysis of sprint to sprint. Is the trending of your defect looking consistent? That's really helpful, and that's also can help you to factor in that 30%. If the team's pretty consistent in quality, that 30% can come down to 20% potentially. If you're just starting off and the coding standards aren't great, obviously you need to increase that buffer, and that. But it's a conversation with the product owner to make sure that quality is considered, and that maybe that defect threshold is one of your sprint goals. You say we don't want more than, I don't know, 10% of open defects in every sprint release or something like that, and you can come up with that as one of your sprint goals.
Yeah.
And I think that 30% is basically, I think if I understand your question correctly, is how do you bring that down so that we don't have just assume we're going to waste 30% on rework. I think it could differ per team. I think the most important thing is to make notes of those things and in your retros try and get to the root cause of what caused those defects. Was it communication? Was it release management where faulty versions were deployed to your test environment and you had to retest? Was it unclear requirements or acceptance criteria, whatever the case may be, and then work at those weak spots and try and improve sprint by sprint. Maybe I don't think you'll ever get to a no defect sprint, but I think there's definitely areas that you can work on as the sprints tick along.
I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ron, you go.
No, I just want to say I think both of these are good suggestions. It's having that as a KPI of your sprint will allow us to focus and measure and track that. And then if you can do that, at least if it is 30%, you can justify it. And you can look at, Stefan, what you said at the retros, how do we bring that down? So I think tracking it is one of the first things then, I suppose, to do. Start raising that awareness. Sorry, Stephen.
Yeah, that's okay. One of the things I've seen successful, and it's in quite a lot of the DevOps literature, is the concept of swarming. So what tends to happen is a tester will find the defect, they'll have a chat with the dev will go, yeah, I know what the problem is there. 2 days later, the fix released, retested, and everyone moves on with their life. Now what you've lost there is the opportunity for the other devs and the other QAs and other members of the team to understand why that defect occurred and how to spot it. So there's a concept of swarming where when you do have a problem, the whole team swarms onto that defect, right? Now this may seem counterintuitive because you're pulling everyone into what potentially could be a very small problem, but the concept is that by swarming that defect and swarming the fix and swarming the retest, the whole team is benefiting from that practice. And if you're doing that consistently over time, the team will become extremely efficient at turning defects around, and it will stop you relying on like a senior dev or a senior tester or a single point of failure in the team to fix all of your problems. It'll kind of spread the wealth out a little bit, and it'll improve that turnaround time substantially. But again, it's difficult because it's telling to the product owner, I need to borrow everybody right now to look at this problem for an hour, even though the problem might take 20 minutes to fix, because it's a learning opportunity, and that learning opportunity will allow us to get faster and allow us to bring that 30% down.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's obviously assuming that the team have an agreement in place that defects are fixed in sprint and not put back onto the backlog to prioritize. Now, my computer had a bit of a meltdown, so I missed some of the conversation, and yeah, I'm back now with battle scars. But just a quick question on logging of defects. So I heard that you spoke about that, and there's sort of two schools of thought. One is if a bug is raised, it's prioritized and it's fixed in sprint. Using that sort of, I guess, principle of Scrum in terms of delivering something which can be released after every sprint. Now, if you don't fix that bug in sprint, then in my mind, you're creating technical debt because you can't release after every sprint because there's something outstanding. Unless, of course, the business accepts that risk around that defect and they're happy to go live. The other school of thought is obviously you raise the bug and it gets put back onto the backlog. As part of the next sprint planning, you prioritize where that bug is in terms of the bigger backlog, and that gets fixed. What would you three say? Which of those is better? Is there one that's better than the other? Is there one that maybe works in certain cases and in others it doesn't? And at what point do the team agree that we're going one way or the other? Is it part of the definition of done?
I want to steal Steve's answer and then let him answer. It depends, right?
Yeah.
And then he can explain why it depends, but it absolutely depends.
Yeah. So okay. So the first option was there is a defect, but it goes in the backlog. Right? Is it a good or a bad thing? So it's a good thing in terms of you are in theory releasing more user stories, more story points in every sprint. But like you said, the negative of that is you're accumulating this background of technical debt, and you're releasing a substandard quality of product consistently to the end user. And that eventually may result in negative feedback from that community. So there's a balancing act between complete submission and not. So what I would advocate is a bit of a mix. I think if it's a high priority defect, or if it's a defect that has a critical impact to the user, it is fixed before release. If it's like a P4 or P3, like a low priority one, you could push it to the backlog, but it's still got to be a balancing act. I think the team, it can't just be, it's a P3, we immediately push it to the backlog every time. It should be, it's a P3, let's look at it in conjunction with other things that are happening in the sprint. Does the team have capacity? Can we fix it? Well, then let's do that. Don't just create a black and white rule where all lower priority defects just immediately go to the backlog. I think you need to take them on a case-by-case basis and in conjunction with the rest of the state of the product. If you know you've got a really buggy product that's poor quality anyway, you're definitely not going to want to just keep pushing more and more fixes into the backlog. You're going to try and kind of level that back out. So that's how answering the depends question, I guess. Yeah, that's what I would say.
And where does that get agreed? Is that part of your definition of done, which the team agrees?
I would
have it on a
yeah.
sprint by sprint basis.
I would have it in the DoD. So I would have something on the lines of all user stories are tested and no open, say, high severity or critical severity defects are released as part of that sprint, or are part of that release, or word to that effect. And who agrees it? In my experience, it's the business that agrees it. The testers can advocate for it. The devs can advocate for it. It's the product owner and de facto the business that says yes or no, because ultimately they hold the budget, they hold the organizational control, and they are the one that's set the team up in the first place. So even though a Scrum team is not meant to be hierarchical, I tend to find the person who's representing the business is the person that runs the squad.
And whilst I agree with that in theory, and I think that's the right thing to do, it is not always as simple as that. It is still a depends answer. So I think as a hard and fast rule, yeah, I absolutely agree to that. But when it comes to the end of a sprint and that decision, it's to the product owner and business to make that call. Even I've seen, even if there are critical defects outstanding, but the business needs something because it's month end and they want this functionality now for the next week, they might still just go ahead with it. So I don't think it's, and you said it, it's not the engineering team that will make that call. in the end. And we should be careful not for the engineering team to make that call. It's
Mhm.
for us to provide that information and someone else making that call.
I've seen a lot. I'll
Okay,
go after
Steve.
you. Hmm?
Go for it.
No, I mean, what I've seen in many teams in terms of making that decision, practically, if let's say it's the middle of the day, you find a bug. No, testers don't usually just go and contact the business, and we can't just wait till the end of the sprint. So what I've seen work well is also testers don't always know who to allocate that bug to that they're logging now. So I've seen where teams go and they actually assign it to the lead dev, who then will decide who that bug most likely should be allocated to. They investigate what it is. Sometimes it's a quick fix that's within 5 minutes it's resolved. But if it's a massive thing, then we need to get business involved and then say, okay, well, we leave it in the backlog, or maybe it's a lot of work, but it is still critical for the sprint to be complete because it's found in a critical feature. So yeah, I think it's important that things get addressed quickly, or at least assessed quickly, so that you can understand whether it should be in the backlog or whether it should be pulled in. But I've seen lots of times where testers find, let's say it's 11 o'clock in the morning, a few hours after stand up, they find a defect. They don't report it on Teams chat. They just log it. They don't assign it or they just assign it to the dev or the lead dev. He doesn't maybe pick it up, and it only gets spoken about the next morning in a sprint and the stand up, and a whole day's gone by with a critical bug and a whole day wasted potentially. So I think that communication thing of assigning it to somebody, but also following up. Listen, I assigned this to you. Are you aware of it? Maybe make sure that there's a Teams chat. That communication, that fast turnaround time is also something not to be overlooked or underestimated.
You mentioned something there which I want to latch onto, Stefan, or maybe explore a bit more, which is sending of a Teams message or sending of a Slack message before raising it. Is there, I mean, I'm going to be honest, it's been a very long time since I worked in a Scrum team. And when I worked in a Scrum team, it was always, if it's not logged in the defect management system, it doesn't exist. But I can imagine that these days, with instant messaging being much more prevalent, potentially there's maybe a discussion first before it gets logged. I'm not advocating for not logging bugs. I still think everything should be logged, but maybe there's a case to be made for, well, this is so easy, we're going to quickly fix it without it actually being logged. Does that type of thing happen? Would we recommend that type of thing, just in the sort of staying in agile, sort of the true sense of agile? Let's quickly fix this without logging it, or should bugs always be logged?
Does it happen? Yes. Does it happen often? Yes. Should it happen? I don't think so. Right. So making people aware of a critical defect is a good thing. But what happens in these Slack groups, people start, now you have 5 tests, it's all defects, this is a defect, this is a defect. It just derails your whole sprint. Because now people shift focus. Then they get upset because it wasn't a real defect. And so it just creates absolute chaos. There are cases, as Stefan has said, where if it's extremely critical, use the right channels. So if you go to the dev lead and say, this is what I found, maybe that's acceptable, but log all of them. A quick fix is a quick fix, and that's fine, but you don't know what else is around your quick fix. So follow proper process, even if it is a quick fix, and log that so we can trace it and we can pull the stats that we spoke about earlier around that 30% and where that 30% is coming from, because it does impact velocity anyway.
Yeah, and I'll just state what we said in one of the previous podcasts. A single line of JavaScript is also a quick fix, but it could have a massive impact on testing. So whether anything like a quick fix actually exists, I'm not sure. Just for interest's sake, I was involved in a company years and years ago, and what they did was they actually had dedicated sprints just for bug fixing. So anything which wasn't a P1 would get put on basically a defect backlog, and then every 3 sprints they would only work on defects. So there's different flavors for companies. It's up to what works for you as an organization at the end of the day. Okay, Stefan, maybe let's jump to the next point.
Sure. Report testing progress. and concerns and risks to stakeholders via daily stand-ups and test reports, dashboards. So I'm not sure if you have any comments on that, but I mean, definitely not. The daily stand-ups is critically important. I found, for example, teams that use Jira, setting up dashboards that's got a live tracking of current defects, those kind of things are critical so that anybody can look at the current state of defects at any point in time, even your testing progress. If you've got tools like X-Ray or any other plugin tools. So I think whatever tech stack you use, I think just keeping that communication open. Also agreeing within your sprint, sometimes people want you to send out more formal test reports or test progress reports in terms of coverage and clearance, etc. So make sure as a testing or QA stakeholder that you understand the requirements from your stakeholders and understand what to report on, when to report on, what format, and when, what, and how in terms of what it should look like. So make sure you understand the requirements from your stakeholders, and then make sure you report frequently.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add on that is I've seen dashboarding being really powerful. So especially if someone's not technical from the business side, sharing them a dashboard that's color-coded and visually appealing for them to see the status of something, like RAG status is having it color-coded, having it with special widgets and GUIs and stuff like that. A lot of the tools have the mill built in, so it's not difficult to produce them. Really valuable for like end of sprint reports or on the daily stand-ups. You just talk to the dashboards, and I think it gives people a really good kind of temperature check of how the sprint's going.
I must say, I think that's the one thing which has really become easy in testing, which is reporting, because back in the day it used to be such a nightmare creating these Excel reports, etc. Nowadays with Azure DevOps and tools like X-Ray, Zephyr, etc., Jira, with your dashboards you can build it. It's just so much easier to show stakeholders the state of testing, and it's real time. You don't have to wait for that report to be sent out. So definitely something that's greatly improved and matured within testing.
But also
Stefan,
something. Sorry, sorry,
sorry, go Jan.
No, I just want to say also something that is becoming a dangerous tool to use. So with the power of being able to report on everything, we do so, and the real message of the report gets lost in all of that noise. I've seen countless times over the last couple of months where we just report and then the stakeholders have no idea what we're reporting, because it's easy to report on so many test cases, so many this, so many, they have no idea what that means. So when it comes to reporting, make sure we report the right things to the people who needs to hear them. It's really just there.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. The tricky thing is different stakeholders want to see different things, and you can end up with 20 graphs trying to cater for everybody's angle that they want to view on, and it can become overwhelming because they're asking, what are you trying to tell me? I found a lot of the time you can have 20 diagrams, but if you just have your report with a red, amber, or green, that's all people that's stakeholders that are a little bit more removed from the project. That's all they look at. Because you can paint any kind of picture using the kind of metrics that you want to. So
you also can also the flip side of the ease of reporting that you can have with the new tools is you can get micromanaged. It's like, oh, you executed 83% of your tests this sprint when last week it was 94. Why have you dropped that many? Why have you dropped that much of a percentage this week? Because Claire's on holiday for 2 days, so we've got less capacity. Like you can't that visibility of what you're doing can be used against you if someone's not using it with the intent it's designed for.
Okay.
And also be careful of asking stakeholders, what do you want to see? Because sometimes they'll ask everything. I want to see everything. I think as QA specialists, we sometimes need to guide our stakeholders as to what we think they should want to, what we think they should be asking for, because asking for metrics that can create a skewed result or a skewed perception can be dangerous. So, sometimes you have to look at all the graphs or dashboards as a whole, not just as one on its own, because that can create a skewed picture.
Agreed. Stefan, I know you try to keep this podcast short by jumping over automation, but can we just go back to that? Because I think it's such an important part of this.
Oh, goodness. I didn't mean to, but thanks for the
no
question.
problem. So again, it feels like there are two schools of thought with automation, which is either in sprint automation. We finish everything in a sprint. A story is not considered to be done until there's automation coverage. That's obviously for companies that adopt automation and they have an automation first focus maybe. And then there's we're going to do all the manual testing in this sprint and we'll do the automation the next sprint. I think to some degree it's a similar argument to the defect one, in that if you still have automation that you need to do, you're creating technical debt. But in this case, you could argue, well, something has been tested manually, so I can release it. I'm still giving the value to the business. So from a business perspective, they're getting what they want. They're getting a faster release compared to now waiting that additional sprint for us to do the automation before release. But what's the thinking and the feeling around in sprint automation? And are there other options? Are there other alternatives to what I just mentioned as well?
Highly situational, and I want to say this here again: don't go into a project deciding where you're going to automate, right, before you know what's going on in your automation world. Now, ideal in sprint automation, absolutely, that's great, but only in a mature and ready environment to do so. If you have enough capacity in a sprint from a QA perspective, your processes help you to move automation tasks down the automation pyramid to where they should be, etc., then yes, then attempt it. But I've seen recently as well organizations trying to do that, and it becomes chaotic because they don't have enough time then to test properly because they also have to automate. So something gives in that scenario. So in a mature world, absolutely try and do that, but don't even make that a goal or an aim until you really understand your engineering landscape well enough. What we've seen work very well, sprint N-1 automation. It takes that pressure off, because if you promise in sprint automation, the business wants in sprint automation. Whether they know what that means or not, that's what they want. If you promise N-1, it buys you a little bit of time to start working on that. Yes, you need to organize your sprint task a little bit differently then to still cover the risks. But I think regression in the following sprint that's automated is not a bad thing. Regression in the current sprint, I think that's a nice to have if you have that luxury. But again, it highly depends on your organization and the maturity of your resources and processes within there. Sprint N-1 works very well. But what we've seen is organizations sit with a big backlog, and then trying to do it in sprint just causes more chaos. So if you do not have a backlog and you are mature, then in sprint works very well.
And especially considering that the first of the sprint is when the development is still happening. So you pretty much have 1 week. I'm generalizing, but half of the sprint is lost on development, and the other half you have potentially to write automated scripts. Plus, things might still be changing even in that second week. So it's a lot of pressure, as you say, Jan. Yeah. I have seen successful in sprint automation though when it comes to API automation, a lot easier to do, and you can write those scripts up front even quite easily. So that is something that I would, if you tackle in sprint automation, I would start with API automation and see how that goes. But I've definitely seen success stories in that regard.
And I want to say with my comment is that is if you have quality engineers, i.e. people who will do everything quality related within that sprint. If you have an automation team, sure, that's a different case, because then you are doubling capacity so someone can focus on automating that and trying to get that done in sprint. And my comment was more around having a quality engineer that will do everything quality related, and then capacity becomes a problem. But if you have an automation team that's sitting and waiting for automation scripts, yes, of course, the closer you can get it to when you are testing, the better it would be.
Yeah, no, I agree. The success stories I'm referring to is when there was one test analyst doing the manual testing of the new stories and one automation engineer focusing purely on automation. So yeah, good point.
I
But-
guess, sorry, just as a problem that I've seen, and I'm wondering if you guys have seen it, and if you have, how did you overcome it? Is you tend to find that the delivery cadence starts to outstrip the ability for you to automate the backlog.
Yeah.
So the backlog starts to grow and grow and grow and grow, and the technical debt increases over time. And there's this lag, there's like maintenance overhead of trying to keep that automated pack as close to the current sprint as possible. Because delivery gets faster, which you want it to. So if you've seen that, and if you did, how did you kind of remedy? How have you seen QA remedy that, or be part of the remedy?
So what I've seen, so I just want to put it out there. I don't like that. I don't like sprint -1 automation. I like doing sprint in sprint automation, and when that story is done at the end of that sprint, all testing is completed. Now, but what I have seen is in that case, and you're absolutely right, Steve, your technical debt just keeps growing and growing and growing to the point where you need to get in a separate team to just come and work on your automation, because your normal Scrum teams do not get around to doing that. And let's face it, if you give the business the choice of automating our backlog, spending time on that, or testing new features, we know what they're going to choose. So it feels like a losing battle, that. And I honestly can't say I've ever seen sprint -1 where at some point the organization does not need to go and call in a different team just to go and work on the backlog. It always happens.
Or they have a pause, they have a refactoring sprint, which is what I've seen, where they don't do any delivery. They just do a sprint or 2 sprints of working on the backlog.
Yeah.
So we'll just do fixes and we'll just update the automation pack, but there'll be no delivery. And that tends to happen over holiday periods as well. So in the UK, towards the back end of the year, or we'll do a 2-week refactoring sprint at the end of the year. And we'll just try and do a bit of cleanup and housekeeping. But it's still, all you're doing is covering over the problem of this constantly accumulating backlog.
Yeah, and then the new year starts, and you start creating that problem again from the start.
Yeah. But how do you and I agree with you, Leon, as I said, if you are mature enough to do that, do so. But how do you practically deal with that? Because these answers are theoretically correct. But in a world where testing people, CIOs don't really want to spend too much money on testing, they want to get things out. How do you advocate and practically deal with this whole automation problem?
So my opinion is you take in less features in a sprint, and you get the developers to do more of the automation. So it's not a QA engineer is doing all the automation. It's a responsibility of the entire team. So if we, during our sprint planning, we look at the stories we're going to take in, and as a team, collectively, we define the test coverage for that story. And then we say, we're all going to work on getting the automation done for that story. That's the only way I think it can realistically work. Because let's face it, in most teams, you have maybe 5 developers and two testers, or 4 and 1, or whatever. That ratio is never going to be 1-to-1. So unless you're getting the developers to take responsibility for assisting with the automation coverage, I think that's the only way realistically it can work. And that's always the thing that I push for. You have to get that idea across that quality is a responsibility of the entire team. Everyone is invested in getting stories released, but let's get stories released which are fully tested, which means that whatever automation coverage is required is also done as part of that.
Yeah, and I think if anyone is listening to this and they get one thing out of it, it's what you said now. It's that automation, we should stop thinking of automation as something that a QA person will do after things have been tested somewhere, right? Automation, and especially in the modern world, automation can start at the lowest level of that pyramid. And it's extremely important that we get that, because if you don't understand that concept and you're trying to do automation in sprint, it's going to be chaotic. Trying to get these very flaky UI tests somewhere at the end and hope they work, that's not how you're going to get around it. So I think a very valuable comment.
Yeah, and you're opening a can now, because we've not even really discussed the automation pyramid and testing. Pushing tests further down that pyramid. So looking at that overall test coverage and deciding, well, how much of this can we actually test at the unit test level? So I always use that example of a calculator. So if you're building an online calculator and you're waiting for that testing to all be done at the UI level, imagine all the testing that you could have done at a unit level. And the developers can take the responsibility for doing that, or at least assisting with that. And now you have much less for I don't want to refer to tester, but there's much less for the testing team to do, or the testers within that team, because some of that responsibility has been taken, and some of our coverage has been, I want to say, ticked off by the unit or the integration or the API. So I think that's realistically the only way you can get that to work. But I want to ask something else. So sticking on this theme, so if we're talking about quality engineers and we're talking about doing in-sprint automation, now you as a team decide you're going to take these 5 stories into the sprint. You as a team, you decide this is our test coverage, etc. Now you have quality engineers in that team, and they have an automation first sort of mindset. So they're going to go and automate as much as they can. Let's say they can automate 70%. Is it still necessary to write test cases in the traditional sense, the way that a manual tester would, for the 70% that gets automated?
Ask the question again.
So if you so let's say we have 100 test cases, okay, for this sprint, and we've managed to automate 70% of those. So 70 of those test cases will be done in automation. Is it still necessary to go and create test cases for those 70 tests?
Are you go first?
No, I just want to ask. So you said we had 100 test cases, meaning that someone thought of it already. So that had to be written down for someone to automate.
Okay, no, let's say there are 100 scenarios that we thought that we want to do. It's not test cases as in this is what you do first, and then you do this, and then you do more test scenarios. So there are 100 test scenarios. 70 of those are automated. Do we go and create test cases for those 70 scenarios?
I think, and this is a debatable topic again, but I don't think you should create test cases at all if you have 100 scenarios that gives you your coverage. So if you have 0 test cases, I'm happy with that. But if you have, you need to write down what we've tested in whichever form. So if that is scenario level, I'm very happy with that. Then at least you can see 70 out of that 100, and you can understand what that 30 is, because writing down that 30 allows you to make a risk-based decision. Not writing down anything is chaotic. Whether there are steps in file click, I'm never convinced that tester should spend too much time on that. Steve, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say it depends on the width and the depth of those scenarios. So there's 100 scenarios, and you've got 100 user stories. How many of those user stories are covered by those 100 scenarios, and at what depth are those scenarios covering those user stories? So are they all positively skewed? So you got no negative coverage. So okay, in that case, I may do some of those manual tests from a negative perspective, negative path. So I think it also depends on how deep and wide that coverage of those 70 gives you, and then what risk, and then it's balancing that coverage versus the amount of risk the business is willing to accept for that coverage. So that's I coined it with a client a couple of weeks ago as minimal viable tests, which was a critical mass of, in this case, is a mix of automation and manual tests and scenarios. It's a critical mass of, I think that's enough. That should give you enough evidence for you to make a decision on. I'm not saying we can't do more testing. I'm not saying I get complete coverage, but as like a bare minimum, that gives you information to make an informed decision. And I think that 30 question comes to, does the 70 of those automated tests give the business enough information to make an informed decision about the quality of that product? If it doesn't, you'll need to do some manual tests. If it does, great. That's how I would look at it.
And what you're saying, so, and here we have to be very careful, right? Because whether those 100 are automated, 10 of them or 90 or 70 or 100 of them, doesn't make a difference in your coverage, right? So whether they are written down in automation framework or somewhere else shouldn't really be the question. Like you said, Steve, it should be, what does that cover? Those ones, right? If they're automated, that means that in the future we can run them quicker. That's all that automation means for that. but it doesn't talk to coverage or risk. So to answer your question, and Leon, it is, as Steve said, looking at what it is covering and deciding whether we should cover more and more scenarios based on what we are seeing. So I don't think the automation plays a role whether they are written down or not in the risk and coverage and what we're trying to achieve from a testing perspective. We should ask the question, as Steve said, what does it cover, and are we happy with the coverage that the 100 gives us, whether 70 are automated or not? Well, that just helps you in the future.
Yeah, cool. I like your MVT coined phrase, Steve, minimal viable tests. But at the end of the day, it's about risk mitigation, right? So have I done enough testing to mitigate most of the risk? And at the end of the day, if you can answer that, then yeah, you're probably in a good space. Okay. The intention was to cover this off in 2 sessions. Very clearly, we're not going to do that, but I don't think it's a bad thing because the conversation is good. And like all things, you can't just cover these things at a high level and get agreement or look at it at just the face value. You need to dig a bit deeper. So I think let's pause there for now, and then we'll have a follow-up session. Hopefully that's the last session, and we can hopefully cover off the rest. I always thought that the in sprint or the sprint facet would be the largest discussion. So yeah, anyone that's listened, thank you very much. We'll put the link to the first one in the comments as well as this one, and then we'll hopefully see you on the next one. So thanks for tuning in.
This has been an episode of Testing Experts with Opinions, an inspired testing podcast.